And now I'm recording. So anybody coming in now, they're just going to have to miss that part about what happened in Europe before the 1400s. So, but now we're at this dawn where ocean travel is becoming more important, not just for exploration, but for trade. And so you're going to, move goods on the ocean because you can pack ships full of those items that you want from Asia, your spices, your dyes, your silks, all that fancy stuff. But there is one problem still. It takes a long time. So I think we mentioned Henry the Navigator was one of the early Portuguese sailors and explorers. And you could see on the map right here, that little sort of pink area on the Iberian Peninsula, the yellow spot there is Portugal, right on the coast of Spain. And those first trips had to go all the way around Africa and then through the Indian Ocean to get to, points in China and other parts of Asia. Now, two problems there, right? It takes a long time anyway. It's a long distance. And two, in the Indian Ocean, you have the winds blowing in certain directions during certain parts of the years. There's seasons there where it's good to travel one direction, but coming back from another direction, you have to wait for the winds to blow, even with some of the new technology and stuff that these people were starting to use, like better sails and things. So finally, they're like, man, well, maybe there's a different way to get there. Maybe we can find a new route, another way to get to that side of the world. So here is where we get to Christopher Columbus. So Columbus was a Italian from Genoa, Italy, and he was commissioned by the king and queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, to find a Western passage to the Indies, to India, right? So he thought he could go west. I could just leave Spain and keep going west, and I'm going to get to India. He wasn't good at math. He wasn't a very good navigator. And I'm just so happy that everything's named, our city here is named after him, because he was courageous and bold, though. So he, set out on this. Now, at this time already, people knew likely that the Earth was big, and he really kind of calculated it to be much smaller, right? That I'm just going to go west and I'm going to come right back around to China or India. So he sets out 1492. He goes across the Atlantic and discovers, quote unquote, the New World. And I put that in quotes because there's people already there. So other people had already discovered this from walking across a land bridge from Asia long time ago. So, it has to be sort of qualified now, right? He didn't really discover anything because there was people already there. But that's where we get the idea of Indians, right? That's not, that's sort of a pejorative term to call Native Americans our First Nation people today. But that was what they were saddled with, thanks to Columbus, because when he arrived in the New World, when he arrived in the islands in the Atlantic, which is where he never made it to North America, the actual, the land continent we are. He started calling those people Indians because he thought he was in India. And as far as I know, until the day he died, he never knew that he had actually found this new land and thought he was in the island somewhere close to India. But because of his discovery, it launches more exploration. And it's not very long before someone else starts charting, the coast of the United States, of North America and South America, right? They start understanding it's like, whoa, we got a whole new landmass here. This is something completely different. And that starts pulling in all these other nations who want to establish themselves, because you have all these goods, spices, sugar, timber, wood, all the stuff that you can grab from these islands, and more land. So that sparks colonialism. That sparks colonizing the New World. So I have there at the top. So Portugal was really at the front of this. They're the ones that came along first and started exploring, first off going around Africa into China. And then after Columbus, they start looking towards the Atlantic. Their influences, of course, more in South America and some of the islands rather than North America. So, that's why your Brazilians speak Portuguese, because that was part of a Portuguese colony. Spain gets in on the action next, really. So they do more exploration. They start going into North America, cross the continent at finally at some point. And then France and Great Britain. So this drives economic competition, just rivalries between these nations, particularly Spain, Great Britain, and France, and just sort of gobbling up the world and its resources. That's really driving it here. How rich can we become? What all can we do? So by the time we get to the 1500s, now they're establishing colonies in these places where there's already people. So the idea of colonialism takes hold here. So basically, they don't care who's there. We're going to set up our own settlement, and they can be governed by us too. So if you're living on an island in the Atlantic, okay, well, now you're suddenly French, or you're suddenly Spanish, or you're suddenly British, and you are part of our kingdom now. And in establishing that, of course, now we're looking towards the Americas, making settlements, on the actual continents of North America and South America through the, starting in the 1500s. The longest continually occupied settlement in what is now the United States is St. Augustine, Florida. It was established in the mid 1500s by the Spanish, and that is the longest, known settlement that continues to, exist today. Not Britain, not France. It was Spain. Then we have France come along, and we have Great Britain come along, who are actually, establishing those colonies too. Along with this, because of the colonialism, setting up these settlements, looking for resources to tap into, we get the rise of slavery. So from the African slave trade from the 1500s to the 1800s, there's a lot of people still today that want to make excuses for slavery for some reason. Not necessarily excuses, but these sort of apologies for it, or trying to lessen the tragedy of what this institution was. And you'll have people say, well, slavery's existed for thousands of years, or there was white people that were enslaved too, and all this kind of shenanigans. The fact is, yes, okay, there certainly was. There's been slavery since pretty much, it's been a part of civilization since the dawn of time. And there was, people from Ireland that were put into indentured servitude, which is a form of slavery where, you fall into debt with some people and you can't pay your debt back, or maybe you commit a crime and you're put into indentured servitude until you pay off your debt. The institution of slavery, as far as the African slave trade, there's nothing comparable to it, because it was an industry. It displaced millions upon millions of people from their homeland. It resulted in, it literally worked people to death. Particularly sugar. This was the rise of sugar. Everybody fell in love with sugar, and the labor involved with that was so strenuous and so deadly. That was really a big part of why slave labor became so attractive, because we had this basically limitless supply of people in Africa that we could basically force into, and it's chattel slavery, which is basically I am taking ownership of a human being and force them to work for us, particularly with sugar to start with, because it was, and you as a slave in that time, if you worked on a sugar plantation somewhere in the Caribbean, or maybe parts of South America, your life expectancy, let's just put it this way, you didn't make it out of your 20s working on a sugar plantation. That's how bad it was. So there's not any other comparison that you can make with slavery like what happened between the 1500s and 1800s with the African slave trade. It displaced millions upon millions of people. It worked literally millions upon millions of people to death. And then it also was responsible for causing, generations of families to be sold into slavery. You were a slave, and then your children were going to be slaves because you were born into it. So that's something that we're still dealing with, and we're going to talk about that when we get to, the American Civil War, problems after that with Reconstruction, and that's still something. The effect of the African slave trade that still has a lasting effect. It's with us today, and there's that Project 1619, I believe, from the New York Times. 1619 is the year that the first African slave arrived in North America. Right, arrived in our part of the world here. Prior to that, a lot of that slave trade was happening in South America. And on those Atlantic, like the Caribbean islands, and where they had particularly sugar work, but there was other types of labor. They mined, and then of course in the U.S. it became more prevalent in the South with like cotton plantations. So there's sort of a brief history of how we get to at least to the Americas, right? A lot of this was driven by economic competition, rivalries between Spain, France, and Great Britain, driving them just sort of eating up the world. And you'll think about that one political cartoon, which comes a little later. We're dealing with King George III and Napoleon there, but you can see that idea, right? And as far as like, there's Britain and France carving up the world for themselves to eat it up. So, where's the next slide? I need my slide. Okay, here we go. All right, so then that's what's happening in Europe. Europe is setting up these colonies. They're taking over large parts of what was not settled before. There's people there. There's already civilizations. There's of course throughout North America, we have the Native Americans here. There's different populations. Some of the from South America, people like Aztecs and Mayans, and those groups, and they're all going to come into contact with Europeans, and it doesn't end well, basically, for any of those groups. They're going to be pushed off of land. They're going to encounter European diseases like smallpox. A lot of the Native American tribes that we know today did not exist at that time because the effect of those diseases, particularly smallpox, ravaged the population so much that they had to consolidate, and they made new Native American nations. So it really wiped out a lot of population. And it's one reason, and a big reason why there was not a lot of conflict, because they're just were so devastated by disease that the native people in North America and South America just couldn't fight. They just couldn't put up a fight anymore. So they were displaced as well. So getting into what's going to be the United States now, and thinking about how do we get to European exploration to the U.S. So in North America, Britain, France, and Spain all claim territory, right? I mentioned St. Augustine, Florida, that was in the early 1500s or mid 1500s. And then Britain starts setting up colonies. The first one is the colony of Virginia, 1607. We have Jamestown. That's basically the first continuously occupied colony of Great Britain. Plymouth, right? We always hear about the Pilgrims. They don't arrive until about 13 years later, and they're farther north. They're up in the New England area, but they're also commissioned by the king, right? By the monarchy. They're basically given money to set up a colony. So what we then have now, we have Great Britain putting their, planting their flag literally and figuratively in the New World. We have France that's also laid claim to parts of North America, parts of Canada and the United States. Also, they're in South America, and Spain. So that's going to lead to conflict. Now we have my map here. I think I've put that up on Google Classroom, and you've probably seen it before. The original 13 colonies. So by the time we get to the 1700s, all of these have been established. So we have New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. You see this big pink part of Maine is actually part of Massachusetts at that time. So, the British are coming over here, they're setting up colonies. And what's starting to happen, they're pushing their territories and boundaries out into territory that France has laid claim to. So there's starting to be, and there's already rivalries between Britain and France and Spain. So this sparks war. These British colonists are pushing their boundaries out into what's French territory. So that's a big reason we get to what's called the 7 Years' War. And a lot of times more widely known here in the US as the French and Indian War, because the British colonists and British army fought the French and some tribes of Native Americans that joined with the French. The Britons also had, the colonists in Britain also had some Native American tribes that had aligned with them and were part of those wars too. So the thing about the 7 Years' War, it started in North America, and a lot of historians will call it the First World War, because there was battles in Europe, there was battles in India, mostly involving Britain and France and some of their allies. But it turned into a global conflict. And as it says, it lasted 7 years. So it was a big deal. Now we're going to start getting into, well, how do we get to America? How do we get from colonies to the US? And the 7 Years' War is a big part of that. Because Britain winds up going in a heck of a lot of debt by the end of that war in 1763. They need to raise revenue. They need to get themselves out of debt. So one way they attempt to do that is by taxing the colonists, by taxing the people here in the 13 colonies. So over on the side there, you'll see that I have some of those acts, which were largely taxes that were put upon certain items in the colonies. So the Sugar Act, you see that's right after the 7 Years' War in 1764. The Stamp Act was a tax on paper goods, anything, actual paper itself, or playing cards or envelopes and all this stuff. Townshend Acts was a bunch of different taxes. And then finally, the Tea Act, which we see is getting closer to the actual revolution in 1773. So colonists, the American colonists, were getting angry, and they felt that they were getting treated differently than the actual British citizens, the people that were actually living, across the Atlantic Ocean in Britain. Why are we flipping the bill for this war? Britain, for one way they justified it, was because, well, we were fighting for, we were defending you, we were defending the colonies. So now it's time for you to, pay. But this angered. This was a big push towards the revolution because they were getting taxed. They thought it was unfair taxation. That's big push towards the American Revolution. So what do we have then? So when we say American Revolution, when we talk about any revolution, a lot of times what comes to mind is violence and war. But it's not just, battles. It's not just these fights. A revolution involves new thinking ideologically, new thinking culturally, even technologically sometimes. And that's what encompasses a total revolution. There's new ideas, there's new ways of thinking. All of this is taking place. So the revolution itself, we can date from 1775, which was basically the outbreak of the war, to 1791. And that's about 8 years past when the fighting ended. We say 1791 because that was when the ideas were finally completed. That's when we finally became a lot more of what we are today, as far as a country goes. So there were some fighting, and there were some things in 1775 that finally led us, after all the taxing over the years, things like having to harbor British soldiers, and just all of this frustration leads to the Declaration of Independence. So we have this whole room. You'll see my picture here. There's this room full of guys that are signing the Declaration of Independence. Nothing like that really happened. Now they did, sign this document. So the Declaration of Independence was basically our breakup letter with Great Britain, right? We told them we are no longer going to be a part of your nation. We are no longer going to be subjects of King George III. We are becoming independent. And I put that, so we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So the big push in that was because they were being taxed unfairly. That's where that idea of being created equal is, that we were all equal British citizens. I shouldn't be taxed any more than some fella living in England itself. And along with the Declaration of Independence, as far as our breakup letter, was that it was an indictment against King George III. So we're real familiar with sort of that first part of the Declaration of Independence, but it's also it lists a bunch of what they consider the crimes, the tyranny that King George III is responsible for. You did this, you did that, all this kind of thing. So between 1775 and 1783, we're actually actively fighting Britain. Britain's sending over troops, and we have George Washington, who takes command fairly early on in the war to lead the Continental Army. And we mentioned that here recently. That was one of the questions, is like, why was he sort of picked? He had been a member of the Continental Congress, which was one of the sort of first governing bodies to sort of decide on what to do about Great Britain. And, at this time, being well known and being rich is going to get you sort of commissioned as an officer. And if you're, educated and known for having any type of military experience, that's going to get you a long way. And George Washington, had fought alongside the British in the 7 Years' War. So he had some military experience, but nobody really in the colonies had a great deal of military experience. A lot of that came from either fighting with Indians or Native Americans, or fighting during the 7 Years' War. So, now we're in active revolution. Britain's sending over troops, their ships. Most of us fought sort of in the New England area. We saw a couple maps about some of George Washington's battles around New York and Delaware and Pennsylvania over that time frame. And there was fighting farther south in North Carolina, South Carolina. Nathaniel Greene was one of the major leaders of the war down there. Finally, Britain just has to give up. They are engaged in other conflicts, and there's just other issues that they need to tend to. So they basically just sort of throw up their hands. Of course, we also had lots of help from France. They were supporting us with wartime goods. They, sent people to help train, Washington's forces. They were our friends largely because anything that hurt Great Britain helped them. Right? We talk about these rivalries. So they're our oldest ally, France, and it largely came out of the fact that they needed to hurt Britain. So they gave us, as much help as they possibly could. It actually hurt them in the long run because they went into debt. So we end the war in 1783. It's the Treaty of Paris, and it basically states, we've gained our independence, and Britain cedes territory. We had the map. We're going to work with some maps later because you guys asked about that, and I'll use some of those maps to help kind of strengthen our ideas here. So along with just the colonies, there was territory outside of the colonies that Britain ceded to the newly liberated colonies. Okay, so what do we get into now? Now we're going to actually form our own country. We're going to become something new. Now we have, the founding fathers, the people that expressed that they wanted to be independent and were leaders within that revolution. Now they have to kind of come together, and we got to figure out, okay, we're a country now. After 1783, we've achieved what we wanted to as far as getting rid of Great Britain. What do we do now? So they have to come up with a new form of government. So here's where a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers from Europe come into play. That's Thomas Jefferson there on the left. And that's Alexander Hamilton on the right. And these gentlemen, along with a lot of the other ones, read deeply and broadly on, how to govern. A lot of that came from Europe. A lot of European thinkers were thinking about individual rights. We mentioned John Locke, somebody that was thinking about individual rights and liberties. They wanted to incorporate that into our new government. We knew that we did not want a king. We were not going to use that word to describe whoever the leader of our country was going to be. That's why we use president. That we had to have something different than the monarchy or the parliamentary government. How are we going to do this? So we're starting to see, unfortunately, what they wanted to avoid was the formation of political parties. They had hoped that everybody could sort of work together and we wouldn't have these such polarizing ideas coming from opposite sides that would pull one group towards one side and pull another group to the other side. Unfortunately, that's what happened. And I don't know how you could avoid that anyway. But what we wind up with, and this is after our first election of Washington, but these ideas were there. We have the Federalists, which we talked about, which are the group that supported a stronger national government. They looked towards more economic growth, and part of them also wanted to reconcile with Great Britain. Some of the more famous Federalists, John Adams. John Adams was the only, I have John's Adams there, it's John Adams. But John Adams was the only Federalist that was elected as president. He is the only one that actually became president. Alexander Hamilton, of course, a lot of people are familiar with him. More recently, thanks to Lin-Manuel Miranda, he was the Secretary of Treasury under George Washington. He was pushing for the creation of the Federal Reserve and the federal banking to centralize banking. And John Jay was another one who became, I think, the first Supreme Court justice or Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So that's some of the more famous ones. And that was their big idea, right? The difference between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, first off, was the Federalists supported a strong central national government. They looked towards economic growth and really sort of progress and modernization. They were largely holed up in the New England area. They stemmed from, more of the northern part of the new United States. Democratic Republicans were more in the South. They owned plantations. They owned big farms. And I'm talking about the people that lead, our politicians and the people that were actually working in the government. So they're the type that are supporting the idea of states' rights. They believe in the sovereignty of each individual state. The Virginia was sort of its own governing, or Virginia, or North Carolina, South Carolina, whichever state it was, should have more power, basically. It should take precedence over any type of sort of collective idea of a country. And, they, big slave owners, and not that Federalists didn't own slaves, but they had land that they needed to work. And of course, they relied on slave labor to do that. Some of the more popular figures from that political party, Thomas Jefferson, of course, who was the third president, James Madison, James Monroe, of course, all became president as well. And so we see already, this divide that's forming before we ever get to the 1800s, really. And it's largely sort of stayed on those lines. This is going to be important even when we get to even in today's world, but to the Civil War. This matters what's happening right now in the 1780s and 1790s. Really, really important because we're already seeing the divisions forming in the country that's going to lead to the war later down the road. Actually, you guys want to hear a song? I'm not going to sing. I won't sing, but I thought, can you guys see my YouTube channel here?
Yeah.
Okay. So sort of give you an idea about what's going on. I really like this particular song from Hamilton. And who we have here is Thomas Jefferson. And we're going to see Aaron Burr in a minute, who became Jefferson's vice president and who's the guy that killed Alexander Hamilton later. But they're discussing exactly this idea about the separation between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And Washington was neither, but he was more sympathetic to the Federalists. So that's the idea that's kind of happening in the song. So we'll take 3 minutes here and listen to the song real quick. Hopefully you guys can hear it.
It must be nice to have Washington on your side. It must be nice, it must be nice.
Oh, well, can you guys hear it?
Yes.
Okay, all right. All right, here we go. I'll finish it up here.
To have Washington on your side.
Every action has its equal opposite reaction. Thanks to Hamilton, our cabinet's fractured into factions. Try not to crack under the stress. We're breaking down like fractions. We smack each other in the press and we don't print retractions. I get no satisfaction witnessing his fits of passion. The way he primps and preens and dresses like the pits of fashion. Our poorest citizens, our farmers, live ration to ration as Wall Street robs them blind in search of chips to cash in. This prick is asking for someone to bring him to task. Somebody give me some dirt on this vacuous mass so we can at last unmask him. I'll pull the trigger on him, someone load the gun and cock it. While we were all watching, he got Washington in his pocket. It must be nice, it must be nice to have Washington on your side. It must be nice, it must be nice to have Washington on your side. Look back at the Bill of Rights, which I wrote. The ink hasn't dried. It must be nice, it must be nice to have Washington on your side.
So he's doubled the size of the government. Wasn't the trouble with much of our previous government size?
Look in his eyes, see how he lies.
Follow the scent of his enterprise.
Centralizing national credit and making American credit competitive.
If we don't stop it, we ain't gonna vet it.
I have to resign.
Somebody has to stand up for the South.
Or somebody has to stand up to his mouth. If there's a fire you're trying to douse, you can't put it out from inside the house. I'm in the cabinet, I am complicit in watching him grabbing at power and kiss it. If Washington isn't gonna listen to disciplined dissidents, this is the difference, this kid is out. Oh, this immigrant isn't somebody we chose. Oh, this immigrant's keeping us all on our toes. Oh, but show these federalists who they're up against. Oh, Southern mother Democratic Republicans. Oh, now follow the money and see where it goes. Oh, 'cause every second the treasury grows. Oh, we follow the money and see where it leads. Get in the weeds, look for the seeds of Hamilton's misdeeds. It must be nice, it must be nice.
We follow the money and see where it goes.
It must be nice, it must be nice. The emperor has no clothes. We won't be invisible. We won't be denied. Still, it must be nice, it must be nice to have Washington on your side.
All right. So, and you hear them, the thing I like about there is they mention, the idea of Hamilton using his influence. He was the Secretary of the Treasury. Thomas Jefferson at the time was the Secretary of State. And that's what he's talking about there. It's like, I can't oppose, my being part of the government right now is impeding me from actually, opposing some of these ideas. Of course, what's happening there is basically after some of the stuff we're going to talk about next. But we talked about, sort of the expansion of the federal government. We see that in there. It's what they're talking about. They're worried about this Hamilton in particular as a figure who's they're worried about him sort of collecting power under his role as the Secretary of the Treasury. And James Madison was I'm sorry, not James Madison. Was that Madison? Yeah, that was James Madison who comes in right after that. It was one of the other Southern who basically wrote the Bill of Rights. And we're going to talk about that now. So I wanted to sort of just point out there, this is where a lot of the friction stems from in the government as far as how do we run it? What's going to happen? You have one side that wants a central government that wants to sort of consolidate power and is looking more towards a sort of progressive ideas. And the Democratic Republicans are more agrarian. They're more concerned about individual rights to some degree. They're concerned about states' rights, sort of separate ideas, not really keen on the idea of having more power in the central government. So that leads to the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. So are two competing ideas. And I know we talked about this some too. So after the, towards the end, I should say, of us fighting the British, we had to come up with a way of some framework to govern. And our first attempt at that was the Articles of Confederation. Okay, so that was put into effect 1781. So before we actually finished fighting, before we signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783, we have this framework of government that we're starting to use. The ideas to remember about the Articles of Confederation: for one, it preserved independence and sovereignty of the states. Okay, so it put more strength in the states themselves, and as a result, we have a weaker central government. Right, it's not that strong. Basically, what the central government was responsible for under Congress, it settled disputes between the states. So if Virginia and Pennsylvania had some type of argument, then that might go to the central government, to Congress, to resolve. And remember, at that time, we talked about this too, there was only one house. There was one body of representatives that was there to solve all those issues. Part of the other job that they had was to sort of was with foreign policy. So they signed treaties, they negotiated with other countries, but a very limited role for central government. Trade and economic activities were also left to the states. So raising taxes was left to the states. Currency, right? There was no national currency. So that, was another issue. So the idea was we need to fix this. A lot of individuals like, this isn't going to work long term. So we get to the U.S. Constitution, which was put into effect as a framework in 1789, and it's still going strong in 2022. The basic ideas, the foundation of our government, has been around since 1789. It works the same way, more or less, it's in 2022 as it did in 1789. It is the same framework. It's the same amendments. It's the same original amendments. So to get there, there had to be a little bit of a push to get some support for it. So in 1780 or 1787 and 1788, there was 85 articles and essays that were penned by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, who was the first, I mentioned, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and interesting enough, James Madison, who was a Democratic Republican, right? We just talked about him writing those first 10 amendments. So he also knew, even though he was a Democrat, he was a Southern Democratic Republican, he was also aware that there needed to be change. So for his part was to ensure that there was some protection for the states and protection for individuals. So that's where we get those 10 amendments, right? He just said, talking about the Bill of Rights, which I wrote, he wanted to guarantee that there was protection for us as individuals. So, we get like the First Amendment, freedom of speech and the press, freedom to assemble, Second Amendment, right to bear arms, and so forth and so on. All was basically wanted to ensure that in this new system of government that those would be available. So that's why we have the Bill of Rights in there. That's why we have those 10 amendments. It was a guarantee and somewhat of a compromise between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans to ensure that we would continue to protect individual rights and individual liberties. So we get the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution, and the first 10 amendments, and that's our framework. That's where we start. The other parts of the framework, okay, really, really important. Not just about the Bill of Rights. We still have to figure out how to govern, and that is also part of the U.S. Constitution. So that is where we get to the president. We get to the bicameral Congress, right? The two houses. So we have the House of Representatives and we have the Senate, right? That's where we get those two ideas, and the U.S. Supreme Court. So, of course, we've talked about this more so in civics than we do in history, but that's how we balance it. So there's that system of checks and balances. You have the executive branch. That's where we get our president from, and George Washington being the first president. He is the chief officer of the executive branch. He sets the agenda for the country as far as what direction we're heading, what he sees as important, right? And of course, we know that changes from president to president, particularly between parties. And so, legislatively, he's going to look for things that help his agenda. He is also the, as the head of state, he's also our chief diplomat. So obviously he meets with other, leaders from around the world. And he's the commander, the executive chief of the armed forces. So, he can call the army out to fight and things like that. And then we have the legislative branch. We have the Senate and the House of Representatives who write laws. That is their job, to pass legislation. And that works with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is there to ensure that any bills passed, any laws that are put on the books are constitutional, that they do not violate the spirit of the framework and the government. So it tends to check to make sure that there's nothing that's putting too much power in one branch or the other, or is stepping on people's rights, so forth and so on. I mentioned, in every state pretty much has a very similar, they're governed in a very similar way, right? So we have two two houses of legislation, of legislators in Ohio, right? Just right in Columbus. They work in this, the state assembly there. Our governor, right, is our chief executive. And there's also a court system. There's a Supreme Court of Ohio, and they are pulling their hair out right now, trying to, because of these district maps, which I mentioned, right? That's the big thing. That's one of the big news stories in Ohio right now, is redrawing voting maps. And because the Ohio Supreme Court declared them unconstitutional. But that's the role of the Supreme Court, largely, is to hear cases and decide whether or not they meet the spirit, nature of the Constitution. So ever since then, we've had certain modifications. We've had some sort of pull towards more power in the presidency, more power towards the legislature, more power towards the Supreme Courts. But that's all somewhat stayed in the same bound. It's all in the same realm, where you have that system of checks and balances that work, and that has been in place since 1789. So that's as far as I got. It took me a while to put together the slides. So throw some questions out to you guys, or what questions do you have regarding any of that so far that we've talked about? Does it help put together some of what was happening, like as far as our readings? Does it make a little more sense now?
Yeah.
Does it? Okay.
But please, I want to ask if I can get the slide.
Yeah. So I'm going to, you know what? I'll email them to you. I'm
Okay.
going to put them on Google Classroom too. I'll put up the lecture today on Google Classroom, and I'm going to be adding to this. So next several days. So we'll stop here, and I'm going to work on taking us from the start of government, and we'll try to get through the 1800s. So tomorrow we'll work on Civil War, try to get through Reconstruction. We'll see how far it goes, see how much I can get done. But any other questions? I hope that helps make sense. One other thing, right? So we know, just keep in mind. So the Articles of Confederation, that was largely supported by the Democratic Republicans. The U.S. Constitution, largely supported by the Federalists. While we resolved how we were going to govern, a lot of those ideas are still under, there's still debates about states' rights over federal rights. There's still debates about, who's going to control certain aspects. And it's still, and one of the reasons that we wind up getting to the Civil War. That's a big problem when we get to that point as well. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. So, any other questions? So it makes sense as far as how does it feel as far as timeline? Does it help with the timeline as far as when things happened?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. So yeah, I'll give you guys a short day today. I know you had a long science session, so we'll call it quits right now, and we'll keep going tomorrow with some more history. Okay.
Hey.
All right.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.